in this video, I want to talk a little bit about Moten on the affirmative and the intellectual property protections topic for September, October on the LD resolution. I think that it's really interesting to kind of continue the series that we have about Moten here, as I kind of did with the last series where I talked about racial cap. I skipped the part of the series where I usually talk a little bit about like KVK debates when it comes to like Moten or whatever topic that I'm talking about, but in this particular one I felt like it might have rehashed some of the older other videos that I did on how like KVK debates with Moten works, and so I kind of wanted to make sure that we're kind of like pushing in a direction that's a little bit different and actually talks about like the nuances of this resolution. And so I kind of want to talk about the kind of like priorities and the strengths and weaknesses of Moten on the AF, because I definitely think that it's a really good set of affirmative arguments that both critique the international kind of like context of the topic with the WTO, but I also think it really does a good job of just generally critiquing the field of intellectual property law and the idea of like patent law and things like that. And I definitely think that this particular set of topic for the LD resolution is really important and good for how you can kind of bring it into the conversation, because I feel like the questions that intellectual property protections raises as like a cultural kind of like political symbol will definitely become hyper relevant when you consider them under the pressure of like what Moten is writing about. And so for this video, I kind of want to start off just talking about what I think are some of the general priorities and like the strengths and weaknesses of this type of argument on the affirmative, and how you then could address like things like case arguments and framework arguments and T arguments before we kind of start moving into the next video that I'll be doing, kind of expanding on what I think about Moten and IPP on the affirmative. When I think about this strategy and thinking about the best way to write these kind of apps on this topic, I think there are two levels to every critique that Moten can be making about this particular resolution. One, I think, is his critique of sovereignty and like the international as a field as a whole, but another as a critique of just intellectual property protections as like a set of values or a set of logics or laws that kind of like govern how we think about knowledge production and study in the way in which we kind of like participate in those things. I think that it's particularly interesting because the arguments that Moten is making about like the particular international field, especially in some of his arguments about like the international and the undercommons, or his arguments about cosmopolitanism, are that internationalism kind of like thrives off this ability to create a world where sovereign entities are able to mimic colonial structures and apparatuses of governance that attempt to subsume radical ways of life because of the way in which they are able to sustain themselves by making differences between illicit and illicit markets or legal and illegal markets, and also the differences that they're able to make between countries that are properly recognized within national organizations and countries that have less power or are not organized by those like proper nations. The idea that in order to be recognized at the international scale you have to own a nation, right? But what does that mean, for instance, like black people in America that like don't have their own nation, or Uyghurs in China that are represented by something other than people that are like outside of their particular citizenship or their group, etc., or demographic. And this type of like set or ideals for representation ultimately code how we think about things like the WTO and how we think about the problems with the WTO, because like I've kind of explained in some of these other videos where I've talked about some of the key critical issues with the World Trade Organization, a lot of it has to do with how organizations like that are normalized from decades of colonial extraction that are attempting to normalize and create laws that justify the types of colonial relationships that the U.S. has to other nations, that is dictated through various types of international private enterprises that are invested in multiple governments and their well-being, and also how countries such as the U.S. and other like major powers on the international scale just operate through a different set of kind of like rules and coercion than other nations that may not have as much power do. And I think that already makes a critique that's just like the WTO as an organization may be insufficient as a response to how we think about the violence that comes with intellectual property protections. Because then I think as you transition that into what does the kind of critique of intellectual property protections, I think it gets even more like central to the critique that Moten is making, because I think a lot of the arguments that Moten is making are about why things like the standardization of knowledge or the centering of knowledge around particularly cultural icons, or the idea that only certain people can have access to like creating new experimentation, new patents, etc., continues the way in which we turn knowledge and study into things that are commodities that are passed around for the like through capitalism and are racialized through various types of performances of like labor construction. And so I think there are so many good arguments about how things like intellectual property protections as a set of just like laws and as a field of law really mimics the kind of like debt credit relationship that Moten and Harney critique in a lot of their works, and is like really important to the undercommons. And I think thus does also kind of continue a similar line of critique that you start with the WTO, because I think organizations like the WTO also work off of policies of debt and credit through their ability to give nations access to this kind of like international field of resources while simultaneously still leaving those nations open to various forms of colonial extraction through international law. I think that when you transition what some of this advice looks like when you're trying to answer some of the case arguments, I think that the first thing to answer is like, how do you have a really strong method to combat these things? A lot of the arguments that people make are that like Moten's arguments are confined to the academy and therefore kind of do a disservice to how we engage institutions beyond the academy or the academic institutions broadly on face value. And I feel like a lot of the arguments that Moten and Honey have written about how things like bad debt, things like under cosmopolitanism, and a different way of organizing beyond thinking through the sovereign have a different way of providing mutual aid and ways of thinking about service, especially when you think about intellectual property protections being in the field of medicine. I feel like oftentimes when the question of medicine is brought into debate, people oftentimes make a lot of arguments about how things like mutual aid and horizontal organizing are not able to provide the type of scale for being able to resolve forms of like health-related violence that happens at like an international scale, especially with the question of like the dispersal of things like COVID vaccines. And so I think it's really important to have like heavy examples of the way that various types of mutual aid take up and how people respond to the question of like medicine. And I think that that is like incredibly important for how you center a lot of the quite key answers that you want to have for a debate that ends up like that. I think that after that, the real question is how then do you transfer a lot of this advice onto answering question like framework and T. And I feel like when you have such a like Moten does a really critical indictment of the way in which the resolution structurally can't respond to the types of things that you're saying are created through the type of violence of just international organizations such as the WTO, you have really good reasoning for why the interpretation closes out how multiple communities internationally are already engaging the central questions of the resolution on different terms, and that already has like good weight to bear in terms of how that stops us from having debates that are really educational and debates that are really providing value. And so a lot of the arguments that I think framework teams really want to make in terms of how do they get the kind of more procedural value out of the debate are really answered by those kind of terminal impacts being turned by the fact that their interpretation blocks out various ways that different interpretive communities think about their relationship to the international field, and also how intellectual property protection sections out how you're able to interact with this field because of the way in which it already professionalized how we think about standards for experimentation, scientific study, etc., especially in the field of medicine, all of which I feel like you should be able to weigh against framework as a particular type of strategy that attempts to kind of exclude these types of like other perspectives from how we think about the resolution and our response to it. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you'll tune in for the last couple videos that I'll be doing talking about Moten and intellectual property protections. And yeah, thanks for tuning in as always.